Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about Chapter 14, which is interviewing couples and families. As we go through this PowerPoint together, I'm going to be talking about and flipping back and forth between couples and families. So understand that there's some similarities, but there's also some distinctive differences. When working with couples and families, they're going to bring their complexity to the clinical interview. In some situations, you'll be able to see some of these dynamics as soon as they walk in. Others that might be closer towards the end when you're closing the session and you're trying to terminate. That's when you'll see some of these dynamics come through. This chapter is going to provide you with some important foundation for working with couples and families. As you can see in this slide, these are the learning objectives that we have. You can read them at your leisure. So there are some challenges and ironies of interviewing couples and families. The first thing to think about is that you have more clients but less time. When you think about a one-on-one interview when you're only working with one individual, you have about 60 minutes. If you have a couple, you have 60 minutes for two people. If you have a family, you have 60 minutes for three or more people. So there's less time to work with couples and families than there would be an individual. You have to be a lot more direct in these sessions, and you have to keep more of a control within the session, especially when you're dealing with different dynamics. When defining the word couple and families, this can incite some debate, and the definitions are also politically loaded. Always defer to your agency on how they define couples and families. I'll give you my definition, though, just so that you have an understanding. I define the word couple as two people who are involved with each other. I leave it pretty open-ended because couple could mean that there's a roommate situation or a cohabitation situation that's going awry. They may not be legally married, but they might reside in the same residence. So we could see them as a couple. When I look at families and define families, I define families as a group of people who share some type of connection. And again, families could be where you have four people living in a house and they're roommates or they're cohabitating. They might not be by blood or by legal marriage, but they may have some dynamics that are causing chaos within a residence or within a situation. So when defining couple and families, again, those are just my definitions. You always want to default to your agency. When you are planning your introduction to doing the client interview, you definitely want to prepare and you definitely want to plan. Because when you have that interview with them, you're going to find that there's a lot of biases and unresolved issues that are going to have a powerful way of presenting themselves through their dynamic. You need to make sure that you prepare for every issue and every concern as much as possible. Flanagan encourages you to do a couple of things. First, you want to cultivate an awareness of your ideas about what constitutes normality within a family, because every family is different. There really is no one common way of defining families. So if you have a notion of what family is based on what you have experienced or based on your own family, understand that other families may not be the same. So you have to understand that your idea of what is traditional or normal has to be thrown out the window because what you've experienced is not maybe what your clients have experienced. You have to question whether the concept of normal even exists in couples. Again, that's through self-exploration and through having discussion with your supervisor. You want to explore and reflect on your own family history, patterns, and experiences in order to minimize things like countertransference from occurring or transference from occurring, and also to make sure that you are not siding with one person more than the other because your previous experiences have come out and now you are empathizing more with one person. Again, countertransference and transference do sometimes occur in sessions. It's important to highlight them when they occur, process them with your own therapist and with your supervisor, and then continue the sessions moving forward. So the first contact that you're going to have is going to be scheduling the couple. So we'll focus on the couple for a second. So typically one partner is going to be more eager than the other to want to engage in counseling. This is the person that's often going to initiate the phone call or to make the appointment. So you want to make sure that because of this, that you watch out for coalition building. The person who made the initial contact may want you to side more with them, whether directly or indirectly, because they're the one who made the first contact with you. When working with LGBTQ plus clients, it may be something that they question more than other clients because gender and sexual orientation is probably going to be important for them. And they want to ask about your skills or their attitudes to make sure that they're working with someone who's going to be appropriate for them. If this arises, try not to be insulted. It's just simply when we find people that we want to work with, we often want to find people who are going to help guide us and who are going to help us to essentially bring out the skills and tools that we have within ourselves to best help ourselves. You're going to be holding space for these people. They want to make sure that when they're working with someone, that they're working with someone who is the best fit and most appropriate for them. When you're meeting and greeting couples, you want to be equally as warm and kind in your presentation towards them. And you want to stay away from chit chat because that can become problematic. That can build a coalition or cause one person to feel like you're siding more with them than the other. You want to stay balanced and friendly. When you are going through the introduction with couples, I always, and families, but right now we're talking about couples, I always keep it very brief, like, hey, welcome, come on in, let's have a seat. Hey, before we start, I just want to make sure that I have, all of the information here. Robert, do you prefer that as your name, or do you prefer Bobby or Bob or Rob? Okay, great. How about for you, Jennifer? Do you prefer Jennifer, Jen, Jenna, Jenny? Get their preferred names. And then I would go right into thanking them for coming to the session today, talking about what therapy is and what's going to transpire in today's session, as well as, potential future sessions, and then also go into the confidentiality statement. That way you're being very directive and you're not engaging in the chit chat, because that can, again, seem like you're building coalition with one person more than the other. Now let's look at families. So when you're first getting contact with families, again, just like with couples, you may experience where one person is obviously making that call to make the appointment. You want to make sure that you don't bring out that potential coalition in session, but even before that, you need to think about a couple of things. Your theoretical orientation, what you use in a therapy session. Any research evidence, as well as clinical judgment, are going to help you to determine whether family therapy is going to be most appropriate or individual therapy is going to be more appropriate. When you're gathering this information about the family, if you are unsure as to whether the person making this call to you and providing this information, based on that basic information, it's okay to determine even then, is this appropriate for family sessions, or should this be something that's deferred to potentially doing more individual sessions? That's a conversation you're going to want to have with your supervisor in your agency. When you are meeting with the family, you want to make sure that you meet with everyone who lives in the family home. And this is just standard procedure when initiating family therapy. If there's 4 people that live in the home and only 3 people show up, finding out where that 4th person is going to be really important, because working with those 3 people, you're not going to be getting the full story. You're not going to be getting through the full tasks at hand. You're not going to be able to identify the full scope of any issues or concerns. And treatment is not going to be as effective because that 4th person not being there brings a lot to the table as far as dynamics are concerned, as far as sharing the ideas about problems and offering solutions and working through problems. So if you don't have that whole dynamic there, then what you do is not going to be as fruitful. Again, when meeting and greeting families, your book says that this requires consideration. I would not do small talk. Again, I would find out, okay, what are the preferred names if that wasn't stated in the paperwork? And if it was stated in the paperwork, just ask them, oh, hey, Robert, I see here that you prefer to be called Bobby. I just want to confirm that that's the case. Okay. And Jennifer, How about you? It says here that you prefer Jennifer. Are there any other names that you go by? And then you keep it moving. You want to focus your conversation and orientation about what is going to happen based on the youngest member or members of the family. This is going to be an important strategy because how you explain what is going to be happening to the youngest person or members of the family will also resonate for people across the lifespan and part of that room, so they will understand what's happening as well. That way, if you talk in your language is too adult-like, a child may not understand it, but an adult will understand how you put things in child's terms. That way, it gives an even playing field as far as what is going to be involved in these sessions. Some of the things, again, that you're going to wrap up with as part of the introduction is what is going to be happening in counseling, what counseling is and what it does, and what is going to happen in today's session, which is the interview. Also giving them the confidentiality statement. And with couples as well as families, you want to make sure that you share again and again and again that we don't keep secrets in counseling, that we bring all the secrets into the open. So if you are wanting to keep secrets, that's going to be really hard in order to fix the problem. So if secrets are disclosed that to the therapist as an individual, that we need to make sure that we find a way to bring them into the session, because whenever we keep secrets, that is actually going to hinder identifying and solving problems and making the family dynamic or the couple's dynamic better or healthier, however you term it, based on the language that your clients are using. You also want to limits with couples and families because many of them can have different dynamics and different styles. Some can be impulsive, some can be destructive. Often they're not going to be fully healthy. So you want to make sure that you set a therapeutic limit. This is going to include things like if you need to make an appointment that you have to go through, say, the front desk. If you find that you're in crisis, here are some different hotlines that you can contact. So the book author will ask you to think about and how to prepare for power struggles, acting out behaviors, etc. So when you are looking at power differentials, when you're looking at someone who is talking more than the other, how are you going to work out redirecting them? If there is acting out that happens, whether it's verbal and then intensifies to physical, how will you take care of the other people in the room? How will you terminate that session so that that person who's acting out can potentially receive some additional supports? Those are things that you, as you go through this program and future programs, will start to explore, and you always default back to your agency. One of the things that I love to do with my supervisor, and I don't know if you will find this helpful or not, but one of the things I love to do is that I would make a list of all kinds of questions. So for example, we're in the clinical interview. From the introduction through to the termination, come up with lists of questions of what would happen when working with individuals, when working with couples, when working with families, and even groups. What are some things that they can relate to you that can be helpful? If this situation arises, how does the agency handle it? For an example, in both couples and families, if there's verbal escalation, that's showing you the dynamic. But if it becomes abusive, you will learn skills on how to redirect them. But if someone starts throwing a chair, what is the agency's protocol? Do the cops get called? Do they have someone on staff who can act as security to help come in? What do they do moving forward with this family or this couple? Are they automatically terminated and then referred to potentially higher levels of care? So these are all things that you would want to start preparing. All right, now that we've gotten through the introduction, let's go to the opening. When we think about alliance building, you are going to have multiple people in a session. So it's a pretty complex process to build an alliance with everyone in the room. The alliance in couples counseling is formulated as you, as therapists, are building a secure base. by allowing each person to speak. Maybe one time you would have one partner speak first and then the other partner speak. The next time you have the second partner speak and then the first partner speak. This is how you can build small ways that you can help to build alliance. You want to make sure that everyone has the same amount of time to speak and has the same opportunities to speak. That can be set up in your introduction. When you think about joining, this is what happens in family therapy. This is where you are showing empathy and you're making an effort to fit in with the family. Even if their dynamics may be dysfunctional, you can model appropriate behavior. And again, allowing everyone to speak, to share their insights. You know, asking them open-ended questions like, is there anything else that you would like to add? Is there anything else that you'd like to highlight? These things allow you to join into the family because the family has to essentially allow you to join them. Without you joining them, it's going to be difficult to be able to find out what the crux of the problem or issues are and then find ways to resolve them. Joining as well as building an alliance allows you, when working with couples and families, to really get the buy-in, like the therapeutic rapport, as we talked about with an individual. It allows you to get them to buy into this notion of counseling. So not only can they be more transparent and vulnerable, but then they'll be more willing to try different solutions. So when you look at the opening statement in couples counseling, again, offer instructions on what to expect. Use a question or prompt to get the couple to talk about what brought them in here today. So you can say something like, you know, I'd love to know what brought you here today. And then leave it open-ended. If the couple doesn't say anything at first, that's okay. If one person is really willing to jump in, give them the time that you can to allow them to say what it is. And then you go to the next person and say, you know, okay, we've just heard what this first person stated. I'd love to know from you what brought you here today. You can get some insight based on who speaks first, who speaks last, who speaks more, who speaks less. That might lead into the dynamic that's happening outside of the home. When you are doing some initial observations and structuring your sessions with couples, you need to be more active and directive. Having them answer more yes or no questions, or even a lot of redirection, those are things that are going to have to be taken into consideration, because in many cases, couples will have problems in connecting with each other and communicating with each other. So by you being more active and directive, that's going to help them to be more directive and connect and communicate. I'd also encourage you to have them do that with each other instead of talking to you or through you necessarily. It may be better for them to talk to each other. If they struggle with that, then you might have an opportunity to have them talk through you. So having one person speak and then asking the other person, okay, what did you hear them say? And then having that second person speak and then asking the first person, okay, what did you hear them say? And then slowly leading it into them facing their chairs towards each other and communicating with each other. When working with higher conflict couples, it may be advisable to instruct them to talk through you at first. Something to note is that if there is disclosure of physical, sexual abuse or violence, it is advisable to get your supervisor involved immediately and to cease doing couples counseling with them and switching to individual therapy for each person. Simply because if abuse is disclosed, it can become toxic, it could become even more violent, and could cause death of one of the members of the couple system. So if that is disclosed, I would highly recommend getting your supervisor involved ASAP and having them do individual therapy. It'll be much safer, and you can then work with the person who is directly being harmed to then seek support and seek a safe place. Part of the opening is going to be maintaining balance with couples. You want both partners to conclude that you are balanced and fair in your interactions with them. So again, giving them equal attention, equal opportunities to talk, length of time and how you talk, as well as eye contact can help with this. Now let's switch to families. So make sure that you're going to practice statements like this. My first goals are to get to know you better and to get an idea of what's been going on and what brought you here. So that's a really great segue into asking them, so what brought you here today? And again, letting each person have an opportunity to talk with a same amount of time and the same amount of support is going to be helpful. The main goal is to get everyone in the family to answer basic questions about family functioning, hopes, goals, expectations, issues, concerns, etc. So you want to make sure that you keep your powers of observation on high alert. You need to note any shifts that are happening with people, verbal and nonverbal. You will often see more nonverbal interactions and cues because one person may speak and then the others might tense up. Their shoulders might rise. They might get fidgety with their hands or their feet. They might look at the ground, fold their arms against their chest. If they're crossing their legs, they might cross their legs away from a person. So you want to make sure that you keep your powers of observation as alert as possible, which is difficult to master at first. It takes time to do this when you have so many different people and so many different dynamics happening in a session. When you maintain balance with families, keep a couple of things in mind. The identified patient is the family member who everyone thinks has the problem. And in most family situations, they will put the blame on one person, but the focus is then going to be shifted on how the family dynamics might be creating problems in the identified patient. You may have some people who are completely enmeshed with that identified patient. You may have some people who are enabling the identified patient or who are codependent on that person. So keep in mind that the family may throw one person in the spotlight, but that the rest of the family has formed different dynamics around that identified patient. When that happens, it's okay to gather information and then to try not to make it like you're ganging up on that identified patient. Switching from this is the identified person that everyone says is a problem to, okay, so, we're not going to be bashing anyone in this session, but it sounds like there might be other things happening. So, when this occurs, how do you respond? And how do you respond? And how do you respond? And how do you respond? Finding out what those responses are, seeing if there's enmeshment, codependency, enabling behaviors happening. That then is a way for you to be able, as you go through the session, through the body towards the closing, to say, okay, well, based on what you've said, this is what I'm seeing some of the problems are. What are your thoughts about this? And that takes us to the body. This is where you're going to dive deeper and lengthier into your assessment, and this is where some potential interventions may begin occurring. So how this happens is going to be based on your theoretical orientation. You are not going to have a theoretical orientation just yet, because most of those things will not develop until you are further along in your program and even into grad school. But keep in mind that if you are focused on the gathering of a story, you may be more oriented towards narrative therapy. If you're all about the intersectionality between thoughts and emotions and how that impacts behavior, you may be more oriented towards cognitive behavioral therapy. If you are looking to find out what happened in your childhood and how that impacts you as an adult, you may be more psychoanalytic or psychodynamically oriented. If you are more focused on what's the problem now and let's come up with a solution as quickly as possible and try new things, we're not really worried too much about yesterday, but just the present and into the future, you may be more solution focused oriented. So understand that you will not develop this until a little bit later into your studies, but start keeping them in mind. What is it that you're looking for when you want to work with people? What are some questions that you want to know about them that's important to you? So, some theoretical orientations to think about with couples is that you may be more behaviorally focused. You may use some more emotional centered approaches where it's focused on the emotion that ties into how they think and how they behave. Again, psychodynamic as well as multi-generational approaches. With some psychodynamics, you look at what's happened in the childhood. Multi-generational approaches, you're looking at what has happened in other generations as learned behaviors and how that's manifested to you. Also, some social constructionist approaches. What does society say that has shaped you and your learning and how you understand the world, which may be impacting how you engage in your behaviors? And finally, some systemic approaches. This might be the family system. What happened in your family system when you were a younger person? And how does that impact how you now react as an adult? What did you observe? What was modeled for you? Were you operationally or classically conditioned to do certain things when you were younger that has now led you to where you are today as an adult? When you are looking for couples and obtaining a romantic history, this is a strategy that can produce some positive memories as well as some positive interactions amongst the couple. It gives them an opportunity to talk about what some of the good times were or where some of the better times were. Because again, when they're coming to you, they're often not going to be in a good place or space. So having the ability to start thinking about some of those happier moments may actually help them in the short term. The romantic history will involve asking both partners how they met, what they found attractive about one another, some positive dating experiences, some really good memories, maybe even going as far as to asking about the proposal, maybe even the wedding itself and the honeymoon. You want to track the interaction patterns between the clients, especially when you're with your couples, because it's important to keep them focused on the positives instead of ruminating in the negatives. When they ruminate on the negatives, they may start internalizing many of those negative memories and negative um, connotations about what they're facing today, which can fester and make things like explosive verbal outbursts stronger. It's also important to observe their couples and families during their conflict styles. What happens in your session, including tone, language, eye contact, or lack thereof, how they position their bodies. That's all going to speak volumes about what's happening outside of the session. And again, you may not get the full idea in your initial client interview with them, but as you go through future sessions, this may play out in a more dramatic way. So this will absolutely offer you an insight into, if this is happening in my office, goodness gracious, what's happening outside of the office. And again, you want to watch out for coalition efforts. One part of the client and one part of the family, sometimes even two members of the family, they may be competing for you to side with them more than the other, especially if there's a disagreement. For example, if a couple is coming to you because they are trying to have children and they can't agree on parenting styles, one person may try to get you to buy into their idea of parenting that is different than the second person because they believe that their way is the right way. So they may say things like, you know what I mean? What are your thoughts? Do you agree with me? That is trying to get you to build a coalition with them. Make sure that you keep an eye out on this because it can be overt, can be subtle, but it does happen. In emotionally focused cognitive therapy, the therapist will collaborate and empathetically track the couple's negative interaction patterns and use the client's language to help them become more aware of the power of the cycle instead of blaming each other. So if you are a more emotionally focused individual, this might be something that you would start to do. There's going to be a lot of reflecting in emotionally focused cognitive therapy, a lot of it. Something to take away from this is that you can express empathy for both partners because you need both people to form some type of attachment with you so that you can get the buy-in in order to help them to identify problems, identify solutions, and carry out those solutions. You also may have to reframe motives, behavioral exchanges, and some emotional bids. Relationship partners have great insights into each other's maladaptive patterns, but often have very little awareness of their own. So I want you to do this for me right now. I want you to lift up your left hand, and I want you to point your left pointer finger. So something that my grandfather taught me is that when you point a finger, three, the middle finger, the ring finger, and the pinky finger all point back at you. So when you point a finger, three point back at you. It's very easy to highlight someone else's shortcomings, but understand that you have 3 times as many shortcomings, one for each finger. So people are more often able to recognize the negatives in someone else rather than themselves. So raising that awareness may cause some resistance. That's why it's going to be super huge to have some type of relationship and attachment built with not only each member of the couple, but the couple as a whole. You want to reframe the problems as emanating from positive relationships or attachment needs. So reframing the positives into something that could be more negative, or excuse me, from the negative that could be more positive. To let them know that, you know, that many couples experience issues with communication, and that sometimes we just get so caught up in our heads with trying to respond to what is being asked that we don't really hear what's being asked. It's a very common concern amongst couples. And also watch out for and identify emotional bids. You may have people in the couple session who are going to try to vie for your empathy or your sympathy. For example, if one member of the system in this couple system is not getting their way, or even the family system, if they're not getting your way, right? And they're not getting the thing that they need from the other person, they may start crying in session. If the second person says, oh, here we go again, that person who's crying may look to you to express additional empathy or sympathy. That can actually be detrimental in a session. So you want to make sure that you remain as neutral as possible, and maybe even highlight, okay, let's take a step back here, because what I've noticed is that, you know, person number one, that you started crying, and that person number two, you made a comment. Is this something that happens regularly, or is this something that has happened before? They may say yes. Okay. Is it something that happens, or even not even that? How often does something like this happen? What would you say in a given week, or a given 2-week period, or a given monthly period? That way you can start seeing what are some of the problems. You can start breaking down some of those issues and those barriers right away. And you're also reframing the emotional bids from someone who is trying to overtly attach themselves to you to someone who now is not only reacting negatively to their partner, but now may also take a step back from you if you engage in that person who's overly emotional. With couples, you're going to be providing a lot of psychoeducation. You might start providing a lot of psychoed about things like communication, for example, avoiding criticisms, using soft startups instead of flipping out on them, kind of giving them key phrases they can use to lead into a problem or a concern. Different ways and tools they can express affection and desire for closeness, as well as taking time outs, identifying when one partner is shutting down and the other person wants to react, how you can come up with essentially a safe word or safe phrase or something that can be used constructively without harm to help them to take a step back, for each person for a period of time to collect themselves, and then come back together again to address the issue or the concern directly. Some other core content areas that you're going to talk about with couples is going to be sex and intimacy, their finances, in-laws, parenting, especially parenting styles, relationship commitment, especially if there might be a looming secret of infidelity, as well as family of origin dynamics. These are things that you're going to be covering in the intake session. Now, let's talk about theoretical orientations with families. Many of these things we've already talked about with, Many of these things we've talked about with our couples clients, but some of them are not, they can be used for couples, but they haven't been fully addressed. So let's look at the experiential humanistic family therapy. When we think about this, we are looking at essentially how you are identifying positive feelings and you're guiding the family away from the identified problem towards new perspectives, as well as not only as a system, but also in the self. So you're going to be highlighting that this is the problem, but this could be a common problem, but how can we reframe how we think about this problem, and how can we identify this problem a little bit differently? When you're looking at research-based approaches, multi-systematic family therapy, that the parents each bring in their own systems concerns. So when you have two different sets of systems concerns that are now impacting the current system, breaking apart those systems to see how the negative aspects of those systems have impacted the current system is something that you could do in therapy. The other thing to think about would be genograms. And a genogram is something that is used a lot in family therapy. It's a picture display of a person's family relationship with things like marriage and divorce, as well as medical histories. And it goes beyond a traditional family tree because it allows the user to visualize different patterns of things that have impacted the family, like psychological, mental health issues, medical issues, substance use issues, um, things that have impacted the relationships like births, deaths, marriage, divorce, etc. And there's a specific way to do it. You'll learn this in a family therapy class as you go through your programming. But knowing how to do a basic genogram is going to be essential, especially if you work with families a lot, because it gives you an understanding of how the family of origin has worked. What are the dynamics? How have previous generations or are different generations, multi-generational perspectives impacting the current family dynamic? So, when you gather the family therapy goals, something to think about is this. We always ask each member what he or she would like to have changed in the family and how, and even if members contradict each other, each input becomes the basis of the goal. The key to family therapy when finding a goal is making sure that everyone's interpretation of the goal is validated and inputted, not only as part of the problem, but also as part of the solution, what those goals are going to be. This will emphasize inclusion and minimize the identified patient. It will allow everyone to have an even playing field in talking about what should the goals be for therapy. You know, validating, that's going to be huge because in many families, especially when there's that identified patient, they lose validation and they lose inclusion. Many of them often are in the survival mode, but now by including them into the goals and every person having a say, even in using their own language, that's going to be helpful in getting not only the buy-in and the coalition all together, but that inclusion will allow them to want to work on it together because everyone now has had a process or a portion of their say into the goals. We also need to talk about the willingness to make changes. Each person's willingness to do homework, to try new things, and experiment with change will affect the outcomes. So you can ask each person when, where, and how things will get done. What is going to be their willingness to make a change? If someone is not willing to make a change, that will say a lot. You might even be able to get them to make a step towards change. Even that small step is still a willingness to make change. So if the willingness is that they have a family game night, but someone says, well, I have a lot on my plate and I have a huge social circle and I've got multiple jobs and homework and schoolwork, then maybe getting the buy-in from everyone else, like, okay, does everyone recognize that this member of the family has a lot on their plate right now? Okay, well, can you think of at least 1 hour a week where you don't have that much going on? How does the rest of the family feel about using this 1 hour a week to make it a family time? We can schedule in advance so everyone can clear their schedules. And it's a way for all of us to get together. Maybe it's going to be eating dinner or playing a board game or a card game. That way, you are trying to make it an even playing field. Even though you're adhering to one person's schedule, their willingness to put aside that time and the family's willingness to accommodate this person's schedule shows across the board that there is in fact willingness to make changes, and that's huge. So many different people like kids, parents, neighbors, friends, coworkers, they can play influential roles in the happiness or the unhappiness of couples and families. So please make sure that as you're gathering this information that you start assessing Who are people that may be impacting the couple or impacting the family externally that may be a positive and or potentially negative or healthy or unhealthy or happy or unhappy reaction to the couple and the family. When you think about LGBTQ plus individuals, they're exposed to higher cultural stressors than many cisgender family members who fit more easily into a dominant culture. So take into consideration that, you know, there are these cultural stressors that are in play, and that there may be more people who impact them negatively. Therefore, it might be a little bit harder to find people who are healthier for them. When you're gathering information about substances like drugs and alcohol, as well as violence, this is going to be essential because it needs to be made clear to everyone that any issues mentioned on the questionnaires or intake forms are not confidential. So if there's a substance use history, if there's been experimentation with substances without the other people knowing, if there's been infidelity, if there has been a number of issues or concerns, again, we don't keep secrets, so those secrets will come to light. Now let's think about the closing and the termination. When you're working with multiple people and different dynamics in the couples and the family, time will pass quickly. When you are thinking about adding more people in less time, keeping time boundaries is going to be critical. For many people when they're first starting out, at least what I've guided them to consider is keep either a watch or have your phone nearby, and don't have your phone out. Maybe you keep it in your pocket, and you know when the session starts. Set a vibration setting on your watch or your phone so that it vibrates when 55 minutes is passed. That way, when you hear that vibration, you know, okay, I just want to let you all know that we have 5 minutes left, and then you can keep an eye on the clock to make sure that those 5 minutes pass, and then you end the session. That gives you 5 minutes to wrap everything up, schedule your next appointment, and get them out the door. When there are new issues that are raised, unless it's a crisis, you want to set limits to close the session. You want to make sure in that 5-minute period that you summarize what happened in the session, that you clarify any homework that you've provided to the couple or the family, and you want to make sure that you leave them with a sense of hope. One of the things that I do in many of my sessions when I'm closing out, after I'm done summarizing what we've talked about and you know what goals we've worked towards in the session, once I've gotten done clarifying homework, I always ask each of my clients to identify one positive thing that they've gotten from the session today in one word. What can they say? That might be vulnerable. It might be joy. It might be clarity. Whatever that word is for them, I ask them to think of that word. If they're struggling to find a word, I ask them to think about a positive attribute that they've gotten from the session, a positive attribute that they see not only in themselves, but also in their partner or in their other family members. That way you're giving them hope and you're leaving them on a positive note. There's some special considerations we have to take into consideration as well. You want to identify, manage, and modify conflict. So there's a difference between conflict process versus conflict content. So the conflict process is essentially what things happen before, during, and after the conflict versus the content, which is what was said, what actions actually took place. That has nothing in relation to what has actually transpired. It could have been, I came home from work early. I went to the grocery store to prepare a meal. My partner is usually home by 6 o'clock, so I made sure that the meal was presented on the table by 6 p.m. And then I sat there waiting for my partner, and that the partner didn't answer my text messages or my phone calls and didn't walk in the door until 1 o'clock in the morning. And at that point, I had gone to sleep. And when they came home, I woke up, I asked them where they had been, and I wasn't told the answer. That's the process. The content is, I slaved over the stove, cooking this MF for a meal, and then they don't show up, they don't answer my calls, they're ignoring me, like they don't love me anymore, and then they came home late, and they started causing a ruckus, and I told this MFer, off, and I gave them a piece of my mind. Two very different things. So when that happens, it's okay to say, hey, person number one, I hear what you're saying, but let's actually redirect back to what actually happened. So in your mind, what were the events that led up to this? Okay, what happened then? And then what happened then? And then ask the other person, what happened that led up to the events of you not coming home on time? What happened that you weren't home on time? What happened once you came home? So that way you're able to identify what is actually happening, not the emotional reactions and responses to it. This is also going to take some work, because if you're someone who avoids conflict or doesn't do well in conflict, this may be a struggle for you. And if it is, that's okay. It's common for many counselors when they're first starting off. So it's going to be especially important that you become very comfortable in your redirective skills. And this may be even something that you have to work with your supervisor or not only this class, but other classes, and working through. So something to keep in mind that often a lot of therapists will ask themselves: how much should you let people argue and fight? Best way to think about it is probably not much, unless you have a good rationale behind it, simply because you'll start seeing those dynamics get raised. And that gives you a chance to say, okay, hold on. I'm noticing this, that as person number one was getting ready to speak, person number two started tapping their feet. And as person number one spoke, person number two started speaking as well. So person number two wasn't able to hear person number one because person number one was cut off. And then person number two started speaking louder, so person number one started speaking louder. Is this, did you recognize this? Is this something that happens? How frequently would you say that it happens? So when you start seeing the conflict arising, this gives you some seeds to plant as far as, okay, if this is happening in this room, it definitely happens outside of this room, and probably even worse. So let's stop it now and start learning new ways to break this habit. The sooner we can identify that this is happening, the sooner we can move away from it. When you're shifting from individual to couple or family therapy, you have to think about how you feel about it. You are someone who may be thrown into a situation like this, and you're not given a lot of consideration as far as your comfort with it. So it's going to be super important for you to think about: do you prefer working with couples and families? Do you prefer working with groups? Do you prefer working with individuals? Do you prefer working with more people or less people? That's going to take time, and that's going to take your ability to be introduced to these things in order to find out where your comfort is. But when you are thinking about this just off the cuff, what comes to mind for you? Especially when it comes to conflict, when it comes to redirection, when it comes to observations within the room. Do you do better when you have more people in the room or less people in the room? That's going to be important to communicate with your supervisor at your agency, so that you have that as an opportunity, as a tool to say, this is what I'm more comfortable with, but I want to step out of my comfort zone and see if this is something that I like. Or I've stepped out of my comfort zone with this and it really doesn't fit well for me, and these are the reasons why. What can I do to be supported through this? You're probably not the only competent therapist in town. So if you're not comfortable working with couples, if you're not comfortable working with families, if you're not comfortable working with certain age groups, if you're not comfortable working with certain populations, there's someone else who will be. Depending on your agency, though, they may ask you to try to work through this, to try to engage more with this. If it's something that you are truly not comfortable with, then you must communicate that to your supervisor and find someone who can be a more appropriate fit. When we think about diversity, there are going to be some unique challenges. So when you think about culture, religious or spiritual beliefs, national origin, sexual orientation, gender, age, different abilities, they're all going to impact how the family and couples will manage and how they will interact. So something to think about is that, can you be competent to provide services to people who don't share the same needs? For example, if you are Christian and you're working with a Muslim family, if you are born in the United States and you're working with family members who maybe one is American born, but the rest have come from or the other person has come from a Middle Eastern country, in some cases it's more appropriate for the head of household, who is a male figure, to be the one to speak primarily. If you're trying to promote equality, that could be going against their religious beliefs. It could be going against their culture. So would you be the best person to work with them? If you decide that you are not the best person to work for them, make sure that you have referrals that are available. Before even making that decision, it's super important that you engage in cultural diversity and ethics trainings. You're going to make sure that you collaborate with other therapists who may be Muslim, who may be from a Middle Eastern country, who may be from whoever your audience is that you're working with, your couple or your family, that some of those concerns, you are able to work with someone who can help guide you into certain customs and traditions and beliefs so that you are culturally appropriate for that session. Also provide feedback and get feedback, or you will be providing feedback in sessions to get feedback from your clients. Monitor that feedback. If you don't understand something, it's okay to say, I've noticed in these sessions that you, person number two, speak a lot in the session, especially on behalf of the family. I'm just wondering if this is common in your household, if this is common in your other generations of households. Can you provide me some insight into this? Ask them for information. It's okay to ask for that. Don't ever make assumptions, because assumptions are often wrong. Talk with your supervisor, get immersed into understanding different cultures, languages, regions of the world, and how things like assimilation and acculturation, integration, immigration, how those things can impact how people will act or react in your sessions. As stated earlier, something to note is that the possibility of transference and countertransference is a lot higher with families and couples. So please be on the lookout for that. Sometimes counselors can do something where they overjoin and lose the perspective completely. In other times, they might avoid it altogether. So it's super important for you to figure out what has happened in your previous experiences in life that may impact working with a family or couple system. If you notice that transference and countertransference are taking place, first of all, how will you know this in session? How can you identify it in session to yourself? How can you then take that information and start processing it with your supervisor? And for some, you may have your own therapist. So how do you start, working through these things when they happen? So hopefully from this chapter, you've gotten a little bit of an insight on what it's like to work with families and couples. I encourage you to start thinking about these questions as you are going through not only this class, but other classes in the program. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.